This week, the Pope made a visit to the United States, and if you were like me, you've been watching the news pretty closely to see what he'd be up to. As a seminary student and a bit of a nerd, I have been watching the news wires, tracking what he's up to, and gushing over many of the lovely things he's done, and I have also been playing what I like to call papal name bingo. See, we Protestants lose track of this fact pretty quickly, but the Pope actually has 10 official titles. Pope is, of course, the best known of the 10, but he's also called the Bishop of Rome, the Vicar of Jesus the Christ, the Sovereign of Vatican City, and I've been following my favorite television journalists this week to see if anyone, or all of them together, would use the full set of 10 titles in their coverage of this visit to the U.S. Unfortunately, with the Pope returning home later today, I'm still 3 short of filling in my bingo card, and I have yet to hear anyone refer to the Pope by my favorite title, Servant of the Servants of God. According to the theological and historical treasure trove known as Wikipedia, the first pope who took on the title Servant of the Servants of God was Pope Gregory I in the late 6th century. The Archbishop of Constantinople had just been appointed the ecumenical patriarch by the Byzantine Empire, and annoyed with the hubris of such a title, Pope Gregory decided to give a little lesson in humility and started calling himself Servant of the Servants of God. But that's the trick with humility. The second you try to show how good you are at being humble is inevitably the same second that you failed. In today's gospel lesson, we will hear the story of how Jesus responded to his disciples' argument over who was the greatest among them. Whoever wants to be first must be last and servant of all, he told them. And then he explained that to welcome someone completely powerless, like a child, is what it really means to welcome God. In all of the years that this text has served Christian communities, scholars and historians have tried tirelessly to figure out who in history the author of the Gospel of Mark was critiquing and what part of the Roman Empire he had a beef with. But while the history of a text is important, for this passage, maybe it's unnecessary. Because no matter what lies behind this text, the function of the narrative remains the same. Every time this story is read and we hear again Jesus' words to the disciples, the gospel author gets to teach the audience. Today, we are that audience. And today, Jesus' words for the disciples are words for us as well.
They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Amen.
We couldn't have been on the boat more than 10 minutes when the captain shouted from his perch up above and told us to sit down. It was a group of 6 of us, my husband and I and 4 good friends who had gathered that day for a deep-sea fishing trip out on the Atlantic just off the Florida coast. Our friends were seasoned fishing veterans. My husband and I were rookies. which meant that at least for he and I, everything was novel and exciting and new. We had just learned our way around the boat, where the cooler was, where the bathroom was, not to use the bathroom while the ship was moving, what parts of the fishing poles we could touch when we got out on the open water, and what things were better for us to just leave alone. We had taken our Zantac and our Dramamine, and as far as we could tell, it was time for the boat to pull away from the dock, and time for us to head out to sea. But our captain, Captain Taco, told us otherwise. When I first heard of Captain Taco, I had never actually met a sea captain before. In fact, my only context for sea captains was what I'd learned in movies and books, so on the day that our friends first invited my husband and I to join them on this 7-hour fishing trip, I found that my mind quickly flooded with images of Robert Shaw as Quint in the movie Jaws and Captain Ahab in Moby Dick. Thankfully, it turned out that Captain Taco was a man much more stable than either of these two fictional sea captains. And actually, to be honest, Captain Taco was so stable and so silent from the moment that we arrived that I nearly jumped out of my skin when he shouted down on us from his seat by the steering wheel up above. "Have a seat!" he yelled out suddenly and at no one in particular, nodding his head in the direction of the boat's hull. "We've got some scum on the boat and it's caking things up. Best to lose that scum before we go." So sit we did. And as the first mate got to work spraying off the scum, Captain Taco went silent again, staring off toward the sea. Practiced readers of the gospel know that it's a likely bet something serious is about to happen when Jesus takes the time to sit down. If you track his activity through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll notice pretty quickly that Jesus was an active rabbi, constantly on the move to new places, often ministering to entirely new people. He had a mission, literally, and often seems reticent to slow down, which means that when Jesus sits down in today's passage with his disciples, he's doing something intentional. He's bracing them to hear something critical and profound. In one simple gesture, it's like Jesus is saying, "Take the time to hear me. You're going to want to remember this one." Of course, given where the disciples are, when we tune in to today's story, it makes sense that Jesus and his crew needed some time to slow down. You see, it was just before this moment, in this same chapter of Mark's gospel, in fact, that the three of the disciples had climbed a high mountain with Jesus and seen him transfigured, transformed. And it was at that same moment, in this same chapter of Mark's gospel, in fact, that the other 9, in a somewhat less wonderful encounter, found themselves unable to cast an unclean spirit out of a young, hurting boy. In the lead up to today's story, then, the disciples had experienced some perplexing, even disturbing moments. They were beginning to see new things happen around Jesus, and the reading tells us that they were beginning to feel a little bit like they were not on the same page. They did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask. So instead of asking Jesus, they talk amongst themselves, and naturally they begin comparing notes. Maybe those who saw the transfiguration began to think themselves a bit greater than the ones who couldn't summon the right prayer to heal a young boy. It's not unreasonable. Which might be why Jesus doesn't scold the disciples on the road amongst a crowd, and instead, it's when they're gathered alone in a house in Capernaum that he asks them what they were talking about. The awkward silence that Jesus receives in response is palpable. He could feel it, and so do we. So Jesus invites them to sit down. In no time, they'll be up and moving again, but before they go on, they've got some scum to clean away. They've got to clean away old, tarnished ideas that the new world Jesus is working so hard to bring about will be set up anything like the old one. It doesn't work that way, Jesus tells them. The new world won't be remotely like the old one. It will turn the old one completely on its head. Greatness won't matter. Power won't be what you think. Instead, to be great, you'll have to live completely differently. Whoever wants to be first must be last and servant of all. About 30 minutes after the scum removal process had wrapped up, Captain Taco was still perched on the upper level of his boat, staring off toward the sea. By this time, we had left the dock, and we'd traveled a ways along Florida's intercoastal waterway, and we were within sight of the inlet that would take us out into the open Atlantic. But for some reason, we had stopped. Standing still in the water, we watched as sailboat after sailboat passed us by. As each one came toward us, Captain Taco seemed to communicate with their sailors, waving them on past us and away. He never looked at me, but I think he must have felt me staring. Talking to no one but loudly enough for me to hear, he explained what it was that I saw. "It's maritime law," Taco said, tracing a finger around the steering wheel. "Powerboats must give way to sailboats. Sailboats aren't endowed with the same power. And those of us who have power must give way to others going across the sea." First scum, and now sailboats. I was beginning to sense that Captain Taco was a man of object lessons, which reminded me of another group of fishermen that I knew. Those fishermen, those who dropped their nets and the rest of the 12, must have been getting used to object lessons from Jesus. Anything was fodder for a message from him: mustard seeds, fig trees, lamps under bushels, and lights on hills. He had taught them to pay attention to bread and loaves and yeast, and now he was telling them to pay attention to people, first to a servant, and then to a child. A child! They must have wondered about that one. Of what worth was a child? At least a servant provided some kind of service, but a kid? With no power and no skills, a kid had no means of welcoming them in return. Probably just so happened that a child was nearby, because Jesus could really have used any number of people for his object lesson this time. The culture that shaped the disciples' worldview devalued plenty of others. Children shared the margins of powerlessness and vulnerability with many. They shared this space with the old and with handicapped, with the sick, the illiterate, and those who were cast out and unclean. They shared it with peasants and farmers, shepherds, widows, and slaves, with unemployed, with aliens, with immigrants and prisoners and the homeless. They shared this powerless space with many who are still believed to count for nothing today. So Jesus pulls from this group of fillers and of forgotten people a child. And he tells the disciples to give way to those not endowed with the same power. You want to be first, he tells them, become servant of all. You want to be great? Teach yourself to see that the great ones are not dignitaries or heads of the table, and they're not the ones with power and with endless lists of things to say. They're the ones stirring the pots in your kitchen. Some of them are young and playing in the street. Some of them are grown and sleeping out there. All of them are great even though they are hurting. All of them are great even though they are small. Sit down, Jesus tells them. Consider the servant. Consider the child. We need to take the scum off, and it's better to do it before we go on. It will teach us to give way to others, going across the sea. It must have been difficult and confusing for the disciples. We know this because it's no easier for you or for me. It seems like in this world, in this kingdom, power is the only way to get things done, not to mention that sometimes we feel like the child and the servant. The world pushes us around. I'm not powerful, I'm just me. But if you can pay your bills most of the time, if you live in a house, if there's a supermarket within a few miles of that house, if you've had fresh produce in the last week, if you're comfortable in your gender, if you're documented, if you're white, if your body works the way the world thinks a body should work, if your brain works that way too, if you were able to get here in a car without crossing dangerous neighborhood boundaries, if you were able to get here at all, then you have some kind of power behind you. Which is why Jesus is sitting us all down, asking us first to recognize that power, and then to recognize those who are not so well endowed. To see that if we're not careful, we could be the boat that blocks them from ever reaching the sea. We could be the barriers to freedom and to fullness of life. Jesus is sitting us down, not to scold us, but to ask us to be servants and to welcome the child and to follow a new kind of law, letting them pass before we propel ourselves through. If we can't understand it, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. No one ever has, really. Not the disciples, not the crowds. Instead, they and we are only given the mysterious truth that God's kingdom works differently, and then we are asked to hang on for dear life. Maybe one day, if we're lucky, the words of Oliver Wendell Holmes will prove true, and maybe this paradox will take the scum off our minds. Until then, we live in anticipation of a promise to be fulfilled. And we are assured by our teacher that giving way to those without power and becoming a servant to all is how we will transform this world. God, in God's power, will provide all that we need: daily bread, wind in our sails, and the assurance that even the forgotten will be remembered and even the fillers will receive a life that is full. They had argued with one another about who was the greatest, but Jesus knew it didn't work that way. Instead, he offered them the chance to become great in the eyes of God. It's a greatness that promises neither riches nor fame. It promises something better. This greatness promises nothing less than the opportunity to offer ourselves and our power in the service of others, to follow a law a little more like maritime law, to give way to others less endowed as they travel across the sea.